Y para analizar la situación actual y el contexto internacional de la actividad lechera, contamos con la presencia de Tage Affersholt, que viene especialmente desde Dinamarca para analizar, para exponer y para compartir con ustedes este segundo Congreso Nacional de Pymes Lácteas. Tage lleva 20 años de experiencia como consultor. Lleva adelante proyectos en el sector de la alimentación y especialmente en lácteos. Fuerte el aplauso para recibirlo, que vino desde Dinamarca.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you're ready for some English, because I'm sorry, my Spanish is really non-existent. I do understand Dinamarca. I want, first of all, to thank the organization at Pimel, and particularly Fernando Ramos, for inviting me here for this dairy congress. One of the reasons that I was very happy to receive the invitation was that I never really got very close to the Argentinian dairy industry. And given the fact that Argentina is a big dairy country, I always wanted to know a bit more about what was happening here in your country. So I'm very pleased to be here. I guess that my timing is not very good. I would have liked to have been here 2 years ago, perhaps because at the time I would have seen more smiles on the faces of the dairy industry. But I can see some of you are perhaps also at the age where you have seen dairy going up and down. And I guess we all know the sentence, what comes up must come down, and what comes down must come up. So I guess, we're all hoping for things to improve and getting better. The question is when. Let me here today, I will focus on, in fact, the global dairy industry and the global milk situation as such. And I'll focus a little on the cheese and on whey and lactose. In fact, when I was first contacted by Fernando, my presentation should be about whey and lactose. And then Fernando said, but the fact, that whey is a byproduct of cheese, can't you say a bit about cheese too? I said, well, I can say a bit about cheese. And then Fernando came back and said, that the industry is in a bad shape. Can't you say a bit about, the global dairy situation? So I said, I can say a bit about the global dairy situation. So, in fact, it's there's lots of stuff in here in a sense. I will go through what I have prepared as far as the time will allow me. I've been told 1 hour ahead of us, and then we will have a session for question and answers. Also, if I do skip some slides here giving time limits, I'm sure you can have a copy of the presentation later on. Just very few words about myself. I have been working in the food and dairy industry for many years. And 20 years ago, I decided to set up my own consulting company. And we are mainly focusing on strategy and business development for companies in the food, and particularly now here the last few years in the dairy industry. And over the years, I have worked with many dairy companies around the world. And as you may imagine, not only in Denmark. Denmark is a very small country, so that'll be not enough for me as such. Yeah. I already mentioned the agenda here, so I will start first with the global dairy market. Milk, as we know, is the raw material and is really the balance between milk supply and milk demand that very much decides how prices are developing around the globe. if we here start off by looking at the world milk production, I have here not completed the whole world, but more or less, most important countries in the world. And as we can see, milk production is here more than 600 million tons, and it is expected to grow over the coming years by, say, somewhere between 2 and 3%. You can see here now it's 3% here on this particular slide. Perhaps what is interesting to see is here that in terms of growth, India will be the major growth engine, followed by the EU, and then followed by the US. Perhaps from your perspective, you'll find it interesting to see also that Brazil is expected to grow quite significantly as well in terms of milk volumes. Argentina, only a slight growth is expected here. In percentage terms, really it's minor nations that are going to show the largest growth, like Vietnam and Algeria. You see also quite a growth in Egypt, Turkey, and limited percentage growth in the big milk-producing countries like EU and the US. New Zealand slightly higher. As I mentioned, it's really the balance between supply and demand that's going to decide very much how the prices are developing. And as you may know, in fact, what is traded on the world market is probably in the area of 7 to 9% of the overall production of milk. So most of the milk produced in the world is clearly consumed in domestic markets, but it's these 7 to 9% traded on the world market that really, to a large extent, sets the prices for commodities also in domestic markets. And if you look here at the world, this is now seen from a New Zealand perspective, because this is a slide I've got from Fonterra, and you can see here that if we take Latin America towards 2020, Latin America supply and demand are supposed to be reasonably in balance, with a growth around 2% in both supply and demand, 2% on an annual basis. Whereas we see some of the deficit areas like China, where we'll see a much bigger demand growth than supply growth. If we take the two big producing areas like North America and Europe, perhaps not really surprisingly, we see demand growth of less than 1% per year. These markets are very, very mature dairy markets, and if we take Europe in particular, there's really no growth in terms of population. So the market is very flat from a consumption point of view. India really is the market where we have significant growth, both in supply and demand. And Middle East, we expect to see a great growth in demand as well. Demand, in a sense, is reflected in what is exported from the major export regions. And here this is an accumulation of figures from the major dairy exporters: EU, US, New Zealand, Australia, Argentina, and Uruguay. And you can see here how, in fact, we had a high-level export 2013, partly into 2014, and then exports really dropped significantly. And here, in terms of 2015, it's partly up, partly down. So a very mixed picture here, very lately. And if you look at the color there, the light green color, that goes back to whole milk powder, and whole milk powder particular has been hit here by the reduction in export, and therefore reduction in demand, and that is really, as you may know very well, that is really the China market, as we shall see later on. These are figures here just coming out of the EU Commission, where they have looked at the major exporters, and this is now figures from January to May this year, so pretty recent figures here. And as you can see here, in fact, for more or less all of the key commodities here, like butter, oil, cheese, skim and whole milk powder, export is down. And if we turn to Argentina as well, export is down in major commodities except skim milk powder. And really skim milk powder is really the only category where we have seen growth here in 2015. If we look at the importing countries, the big importing countries in the world, and as you well know, China has played a significant role the last few years. You see here, be it for butter oil, skim milk powder, whole milk powder, China is down significantly, and particularly as we saw early on, for whole milk powder, down by more than 50% the first 5 months of this year. Cheese to China is still at a very fairly low level, but that is the only one that is keeping constant here. Another market that used to be a very important import market is Russia, and as we can see here also in terms of be it butter oil or cheese and whole milk powder, Russia is down as well here the first 5 months. Interesting to see that in the US, US has been able to absorb a lot more cheese than the 5 months last year. And then here, as you can see this slide, Algeria, we don't have figures for Algeria. Algeria being another important import market, as I guess you know very well. Mexico, perhaps from your perspective, is also important, and you can see Mexico keeps increasing their import quantities. Just coming back to the China situation for whole milk powder, you can see here the huge amounts of whole milk powder that went into China in 13 and particularly in 14. If you look at the first quarter in 14, we are talking about close to 400,000 tons of whole milk powder going into China. And you can see here from the second quarter and onwards, these volumes have decreased dramatically. And that, I guess you can say in a sense, that was really the reason why the global market collapsed. Then you can say that the Russian situation did not make things better as such, but I think, it's the real reason is China. And then on top of that, we got the import ban into Russia from August 2014. And as you may know, that has been extended for another year vis-a-vis the EU, and perhaps you can say that it's bad for the EU, and perhaps, hopefully, I would say it may be good for Argentina. But here, in terms of cheese, you can see cheese import into Russia going down, again, dramatically. Other parts of the world have made up, at least to a certain extent, for the lack of import into China and Russia. all the countries that are green here are the ones that have increased their import in the first quarter of 2015 versus 2014. And the figures here, they are in so-called liquid milk equivalents. I guess you all understand, when you translate, say, cheese into milk equivalents, you multiply by, say, 8 or 9 or whatever, yeah. So the figures here are in liquid milk equivalents. You can see here US having increased their import, as we discussed earlier on, Brazil and Middle East and some parts of Africa, Nigeria again being a very important import market, and clearly Southeast Asia, another growing milk market. If we compare production in the traditional milk exporting countries here for the first 5 months of this year, you can see here that the growth has really been limited around less than 1%. But a mixed picture, small volume increase in the US, small volume increase in New Zealand, Uruguay and Australia, and given the figures here from the EU Commission, apparently Argentina has had a small reduction in milk output the first 5 months of this year. But really the big animal here in terms of increased production, that is the US. If we compare supply, these are the latest figure from the second quarter this year. If we compare supply to export, and as I say, export is a good indicator of demand in the main dairy regions. You can see here really in all the regions supply has growing, or milk production, supply has growing more than exports. There's really only one country that has been able to increase its export more than its supply, and that's Australia. So when you see these figures, I guess it is really not surprising that we are living through a very difficult period. And as you can see here from this slide, prices have come down dramatically since the very high level in 12-13. And when farmers around the world get this stimulus about very high prices, then farmers, they normally react pretty quickly and increase their production of milk. Whereas when prices are coming down, we see that the supply is not really very elastic. Even when at very low prices, farmers tend to continue for a long time to produce the high level of milk. Yeah. So, but if you look back here, as you can see, and this was what I referred to in the very beginning in my opening remarks, we have in the past we have seen the same kind of volatility in dairy commodity prices as we see now. I'm sure we all would like to see a level again back, say in 2008, 2009, or 12-13. I guess it should be mentioned here that the last 2 auctions on the so-called global dairy trade platform, the one that is operated by Fonterra, prices did go up quite significantly. This week here, prices went up 10%, and the 2 weeks ago, prices went up 15%. So, and also, when you look at internal prices in the EU, here this week, prices are slightly up. So it may be that we have now seen the bottom of the prices, and we are seeing the first signs of a reversal of the situation. Here I have tried to look at self-sufficiency rates around the world. And it's no surprise, in Oceania, North America and Europe, we have a surplus of production compared to domestic internal demand. South America, as you can see here from this, and that corresponds to the slide we saw earlier, is very much from a macro point of view, is very much in balance. Whereas if we look at Asia, Africa, Central America and Middle East, these parts of the world will always need import to satisfy their domestic demands. And if we take some individual countries that are or traditionally have been very, very important import markets, you can see China, Russia, Venezuela, Mexico, Japan, Korea. These are really not self-sufficient in terms of milk supply. So, and the other information here on this slide, that is the per capita consumption, again in liquid milk equivalents. And this leads one to say that when you look at the per capita consumption in the developed part of the world compared to some of the other parts of the world, there seems to be a strong growth potential once the economic growth continues. This is the historical development here for the last 5 years. The size of the bubble indicates how much milk is being consumed. And you can see here that India is a very, very big, not only a big producer, but a big consumer of milk. But India is very much a kind of a closed market in the sense that really India does not really participate in the world market, and India does not really import a lot of dairy. So if we exclude India, you can see here for the last 5 years, China has been, as I said earlier on, a kind of a growth engine for the world market, growing by close to 5% per year, and followed by Southeast Asia, Africa, Middle East, whereas, as we saw earlier on, EU and NAFTA, with very, very limited growth in demand. So how will it look like the next 5 years? India again, with a large absolute growth in milk consumption, and also, in terms of percentage growth, very high. Whereas, in fact, we see a little more of a reduced percentage growth in China, whereas now Africa, Southeast Asia, North Africa are the ones with the higher percentage growth rates. Looking towards 2020, this is just a sort of a simple illustration that we expect something like 20 billion more liters to be consumed around the world, and we have here an illustration of the countries that are supposed to also supply the additional volumes for the next 5 years. And here, as you can see here, the Brazil is expected to move into becoming more or less a net exporter. So that might be, a new development from an Argentinian point of view as well. I'll now turn to have a look at the at the dairy industry as such, the processes. Excuse me for a second, yeah. I'm sure you're very familiar with some of the big companies on a global scale in dairy industry. These are listed here, and I guess most of the names are well known also here in your part of the world. I think what is interesting to notice that is that we have now got Chinese companies on the list of the top 20 dairy companies in the world. That did not used to be the case, but now Yili and Mengyu are two of the Chinese companies entering this particular top 20 list. And I think we may expect the Chinese companies, in fact, to grow a lot more quickly than many of the other dairy companies. So I expect these Chinese companies to move up the list here. Otherwise, it's some of the same companies that we have seen for many years. I mentioned earlier on that when prices are good, farmers tend to produce a lot more milk. And if we just take the EU, as I'm sure you also know, quotas were abolished here by April this year. So a lot of countries, a lot of companies, they have expected their farmers to produce more milk. So companies started already years ago to invest more in processing capacity. And I think we may say here that the last few years we have never seen such an investment wave in the global dairy industry as these last few years. It is really enormous amounts of money that have been invested in additional processing capacity. And if you look here at some of the logos here, you can see it's really companies all over the globe that has invested in additional processing capacity. The numbers here are from 12 and 13, but in 14 it was really the same story. And I remember talking to some of the global technology providers like Tetra Pak and GEA, and I know at a given time, basically they could not take any more orders. They were simply, their pipeline was so filled up. But here in 2015, it is very clear to see also that investment level has now been reduced significantly. And if I just take my own country, Denmark, Arla, they announced some time back here that they simply reduced their planned investments simply to be able to satisfy give a better price to their farmers for the milk, given the very difficult times that they are going through right now. What we've seen also over the last, I would say many years, that is that the global dairy industry is consolidating. The big companies are getting bigger because they want to operate not only internationally but on a global scale. And here these companies and these acquisitions that are listed here are just examples from the first half of this year. So you can see even in bad times there's still a significant activity in terms of company acquisitions. And you'll notice here on this slide that Lactalis as a company is mentioned here. Is it 3 times? And they have certainly been a very active company over the last few years. This is just a slide here to sort of pinpoint the acquisitions of Lactalis for the last few years. It's really only 2014 and 15, and I just counted here by their own announcement. I just counted that they have added more than 17,000 people to the number of people they employ, given the recent acquisitions, and more than 34 plants. So it is really very, very significant. And as you well know, they have been active also acquiring 2 companies in your part of the world, or your neighbor in Brazil. Another significant trend that we have seen the last few years that relates to the infant formula industry. Infant formula is a big business on a global scale, and it's growing. It's growing, perhaps, I don't know, say 7 to 9% on a global basis. And China has really been the big market for infant formula, growth in infant formula. So what we have seen is, in fact, that a lot of Chinese companies, they have made either their direct own investments or they have made strategic alliances around the world to make sure that they can supply their domestic market with infant formula products. And as you can see here from this slide, it is really enormous amounts of money that goes into investments in infant formula. Particularly in New Zealand, but really also in other parts of the world, Europe. And perhaps here, at least to myself, I guess it's a bit surprising to see that none of these Chinese companies have made any strategic alliances here in Argentina, using Argentina as a supply basis. So I will now turn very quickly to the global cheese market. Cheese has been a growing product for as many years as I can remember. You can see here between 2003 and 2013, growing by an average production and consumption growing by an average around 3% per year. Perhaps this growth the next 5 years is going to be somewhat reduced down to, say, 2%, but cheese will keep growing. And if we look at the regions in the world where, in fact, cheese production is expected to grow the most, you can see that is in the EU, in the US, and in Brazil. And a small increase in cheese production is expected here in Argentina, 34,000 tons towards 18. This is just another illustration of how the cheese production is distributed around the world. You can see here with the EU making up close to half of the world's production of cheese, followed by the followed by the US, Brazil, Turkey, Argentina, and Russia. And as we saw earlier on, it is really the major ones that are also going to be the ones showing the greatest growth in the coming years. New Zealand is really not all that important in cheese. Only 1.8% of world cheese production, around 300,000 tons. So, they have a very, very strong role in some of the other commodities, but not so much in cheese. This is just another illustration of the change in cheese production. It is we have more or less already seen it. You can see here EU and the US, and then Brazil and Turkey being the ones that will show the biggest growth in cheese production. If we turn to the consumption of cheese, it's the EU, US, followed by Brazil, Russia, Turkey, Argentina, Mexico as some of the big consuming countries. And if we look at per capita consumption, as you well know, EU has always been historically consuming large amounts of cheese. Around 17 on average, compared to, say, Argentina, around 12 kilo per capita. But you can see some of the markets, they have a one would expect that there's a big growth potential, be it in Turkey, Egypt, Russia. So I think cheese is definitely a product that will continue to grow. This here illustrates the anticipated amount of cheese in these various markets that will grow here, and as we have seen. China here is still, a very limited market in terms of cheese, but I think it'll become more and more of an interesting market also for cheese. I remember when I first looked at China a few years back, cheese consumption was something like, say, 20,000 tons, and I guess this year perhaps it'll reach close to 100,000 tons. So China is in terms of growth is interesting. Again here, this is just a more detailed slide on cheese consumption, and if we compare, we all know that France historically and culturally has been a big cheese consumption nation, and I mean, if I'm not saying the whole world should reach French standard, but if we all move up the list here, then clearly there'll be plenty of room for additional cheese production. If I am to conclude here on the global situation, I think I'll say that milk production remains strong and will remain fairly strong around the globe. Demand is affected strongly by the lack of import into to China and Russia. And as we saw earlier on, some of the other regions in the world, like Southeast Asia, Middle East, Africa, they cannot completely make up for lack of demand in these two markets that we have just discussed. We see a certain compensation in the North American market, where the US have imported here this year significant more cheese than the year before. But I am tempted to say that we're still waiting to see this supply side correction before we will find markets more in balance. Here on a short term, I think there's too much milk chasing too little market. So perhaps not the most optimistic outlook in the very short term, but certainly everybody agrees that medium term, long term, the situation will improve significantly. I'm also saying here that this thing about global consolidation of the dairy industry, I'm sure that is going to continue. The big global players, they want to have a much stronger base in the key dairy supplying countries around the world, and perhaps there are reasons why you don't have a significant foreign participation here in the Argentinian industry. That could be something that one could possibly expect also in the future. So this was really what you can call part one of my presentation. So I will go to the subject that I was originally asked to talk about. That is the global whey and lactose industry. I should say here that my company has, over the last 10 years, we have done what we call a multi-client report on the global whey and lactose industry. So every second year we have published here what we call a whey book, where really we are looking at what's going on in this particular industry, because it has been an area that is not as transparent as so many other parts of the dairy industry. I mean, butter and cheese and whole milk powder, skim milk powder, it's very easy to sort of find figures and really find out what's going on. Whey and lactose has always been a little more complicated, less transparent. So the slides here that I will show you are really based on information from this research that we did here last year on the whey and lactose industry. In the report, we are discussing market sizes, trade flows, applications, and how we see the future, and we're looking at the industry as well. And we're looking at all the regions in the world, as you can see, EU, North America, Latin America, and so on and so forth. And the products that we discuss in this particular report, that is whey powder, demineralized whey powder, delactosed whey powder, whey protein concentrate, and so on and so forth, as you can see here. So pretty complete. This is an old illustration that I've used for quite some years when I'm discussing this industry. This is here what I call sort of the progression of the industry. Really, everybody started off by producing whey powder, and as we have seen over the last, the industry, really this industry started really significantly, say, around 1980. So the industry as such is basically a young industry, only like sort of 30, 40 years old. And when we move here to the right in this particular figure, you can see products like whey protein isolate, hydrolysates, and protein fractions and lactose derivatives. Then you were really moving into specialities, high value add products, really niche products, some of them. And what is also very characteristic for this industry, when it was really a matter of converting products from the feed to food to nutrition to pharma. So this has been the trend for many years. I cannot here today go through all the regions or all the subjects of this report here. I'll just quickly go over a few slides here from this report, and the issues here that are in bold types here are the ones that I'll briefly touch upon here today. This slide illustrates the global production of the key products in the whey and lactose industry. And what is really significant here when you look at it, that is that this is an industry that grows and has grown for all the years. It's a growing industry, be it for whatever product you look at, more or less. You can say, okay, WPC 35 perhaps is a bit of a stagnant product category, but otherwise, really all product categories are growing. But it's also very significant here that whey powder is still, a very, very big item in this industry. Not surprisingly, the big cheese-producing regions of the world are also the big producers of whey and lactose products. So it's really EU and North America that are the biggest producers of these products here. But when we move into some particular segments or product categories, be it Oceania, then Oceania will play a more important role in the area of products with a high protein content, WPC 80 or lactose. Pharma-grade lactose has always been a New Zealand speciality as well, yeah. This is another way of illustrating the global market for these products here. You can see here we are talking about a market. This is now for whey products being close to, at least in 2013. Now I know that prices have come down, but looking at a market at roughly $10 billion and a volume of more than 4 million tons of a product. And as I mentioned earlier on, whey powder is still in volume-wise and value-wise the biggest product group. But in terms of growth, we see whey protein isolate and whey protein concentrates as the product categories with the biggest growth rate. Turning to the other part of the coin, the carbohydrate side, the lactose and permate, then it's a lesser market volume, and it's a value that is more close to $2 billion US. But if we take a product category like permate powder, that has really growing significantly here the last 5-10 years. And I know here also, and as I'm sure you do, now here there is permate powder also produced in your country here. So this is, and as I say, as you can see here from these figures, these products will continue to grow. When we look at prices for these whey and lactose products, they are to some extent reflecting the global market for other dairy commodities. I mean, whey powder and lactose in particular are reflecting other dairy commodity prices, whereas products like WPC 80, WPI or D-min whey, they are to a less extent reflecting the volatility in global markets. These more niche-oriented products, they keep up their prices much better than the commodity products. And if we go into fractions or protein fractions or lactose derivatives, that is even more the case. Then these products are really not very much dependent on the global market for dairy commodities. But if we take whey powder as an example and lactose here, then prices have come down here also the first 2 quarters of this year. And I'm sure you have felt that here in Argentina too. Looking at how the global balance in terms of supply and demand is, here you can see US and EU with bigger supplies than domestic demand, and therefore these regions are really supplying the deficit regions of the world, and in particular in Asia. In Latin America, here for the products concerned here, it looks like there's more demand in Latin America than there's supply of these products here. If we look at the high protein, like only here now, WPC 80 and whey protein isolate, it is still, US and EU, the biggest producers and also the biggest markets. But then here now you can see Oceania also becoming an important supplier of these specialty products. The fact here that US is so much bigger than the EU here, that goes back to the sports nutrition industry in the US. It is so that in the US, the consumption of so-called sports nutrition products, this category, is 4 times higher than it is in Europe. So they take this industry absorbs enormous quantities of WPC 80 and WPI. On the lactose side, it's a bit the same picture as we have already seen. There's really no lactose produced in Asia, so really it's clearly relying on import. Key trends and application. I feel pretty sure that the whey industry and the whey protein industry that will continue to grow significantly. There's a lot more focus on health around the world. Obesity is significant now. You see Chinese children being obese, which clearly is a very, very bad way for the whole development. So there'll be more focus on protein. And we see a graying population, particularly in the developed world. So clearly, that will mean there'll be a significant focus on protein consumption. And I already mentioned the infant nutrition sector, infant formula, which will keep growing as well. So there are, and then here you can also say, we have a significant increase in population around the world for the next 20, 30 years. So there are many factors that will drive the increased consumption of protein and lactose. But this industry does not operate in isolation. There's competition from other industries like vegetable proteins and other animal proteins, be it egg proteins or meat proteins and so on. But still there's room for. I was going to say there's room for all the various protein categories, given the fact that the market will increase all the time. So on what basis do consuming companies or customers, on what basis do they choose to use ingredients? I mean, it's a combination of price, economics, and it's functionality. How do they perform in the particular product recipe? And not least, the sensory aspect. Taste will always be the most important factor, I guess, in food consumption. And then from other particular applications, the nutritional quality is very significant. And as you well know, milk proteins or whey proteins are really among the very best proteins that you can get. I'm not all that familiar with your part of the world, but I would imagine that this so-called global protein trend, that this is something that you see here as well. Many products are being protein fortified, increased content of protein, say in yogurts or in many dairy products, and in fact in many other types of products. And I think we can say here also that the ingredient industry on a global scale, that they realize they need to be more sort of aware of consumer trends and meeting new consumer needs. So in fact, the most successful ingredient companies are the ones that to some extent will adopt marketing practices from the fast-moving consumer goods industry. In the area of health, as you will know, the question of being able to document that your ingredient has a particular health benefit has been a highly debated issue. But I think we should never forget that consumers, they don't buy health claims, they buy what they perceive as product benefits. Another trend that we have seen here the last many years, that is that the whey industry has become much more of a knowledge-intensive industry, and we can see companies taking out many more patents in the area of whey and lactose as we've seen in the past. And then here finally this thing about new business models, that's the example I'll come back to, that we see some ingredient companies that have started to manufacture their own consumer products, particularly in the area of sports nutrition. So where are these product categories, where are they actually used? You can see if we take DWP, that means demineralized whey powder, infant formula, confectionery are really two of the major sectors, and the major regions in the world for consumption of these products, that's Asia and the EU. And if we take an example like WPI, whey protein isolate, the whole area of sports nutrition drinks is the major sector, and the major consuming regions are North America and Asia. And you can yourself here see for the other product categories which are the major applications areas. Lactose, infant formula, again, is a very significant end user sector for lactose. lactose here, perhaps also we should mention the pharmaceutical industry for lactose. On this slide here, we have tried to make up on a global scale where are the different products, in which sectors are they actually used. And here, if we take now here the example of permade powder, then we think that still by far the largest part of permade powder, that's PP, is going into feed, but we'll see more and more permade powder, in fact, being converted into food applications in the future. Lactose, as I said, pharmaceutical sector being important, and WPI, the sports nutrition sector, being by far the most important. If we look at where are new products being launched containing whey, you can see here that the most dynamic markets are in the Asia-Pacific area, followed by North America. So this is really where whey is put on the label as an ingredient. So this it doesn't measure the size of the market, but where are the most products launched that contain whey products. I have already mentioned some of these industries here, infant formula, clinical nutrition, sports nutrition. You can see here that these are big businesses on a global scale, but perhaps more interesting also that these businesses, they keep growing. So, in parts of the world, we have many food sectors that are more or less constant. There's really no growth in the market. So it's always interesting to find sectors where there is a significant growth. And this is what we see here in these sectors that I mentioned here. In the report, we have tried to calculate how much do these various sectors, how much do they use in terms of whey protein, and you can see here the figures that we have calculated in terms of proteins. Demin whey, 250,000 tons. We think will go into to the infant formula industry. And sports nutrition, very important for WPI and WPC80, as I mentioned. And I'm sure also that you're familiar with some of the key names mentioned here as the biggest companies consuming these products. This here is a slide from the Chinese market for infant formula. And one of the reasons I've taken this is simply to illustrate here that you can see close to 70% of the products that are being launched in infant formula in China, they contain whey proteins. And half of these whey proteins are derived from Demin whey, and the other half is derived from whey protein concentrate. Perhaps interesting to see also here that a protein fraction like alpha lactalbumin is contained is roughly 17% of all new product launches. So alpha lactalbumin is clearly one of the very interesting ingredients for the future for the infant formula industry. Clinical nutrition. I'll not really spend more time on clinical nutrition. I'll take the example here of sports nutrition. You may probably know the dairy company in Ireland called Glanbia. It used to be I would say a traditional dairy company. Over the last 10-15 years, they have really converted themselves into becoming first a kind of a global ingredients company, and then secondly, now they're converting themselves into becoming the most important company in sports nutrition around the world. So you can say that they have now their own captive use for the whey proteins that they produce, because they control these companies that operate in the sports nutrition sector. So on a global scale, sports nutrition is still a very fragmented business, but again, this industry is becoming much more of a consolidated business, and now with Glanbia being the most significant player in this area. And if you look at dairy companies and their half-year results right now, I mean, so many dairy companies are coming out with half-year results where, in fact, results or the revenue is constant or perhaps even decreasing. And if you take an example here now, this here, the figure here I have is for the first half of 2014 for Glanbia. You can see that their revenue was up on the sports side by 22%. I mean, it's very much in contrast to what we see in dairy in general. So it just illustrates the importance of moving into areas that are showing significant growth. Other dairy companies are going a bit the same way. Here I mentioned Volag in the UK and Carberry in Ireland, also moving downstream and doing their own sports nutrition products. I guess I will have just 2 minutes left, perhaps. I'll quickly. This is a slide here illustrating how I see, the biggest companies in whey and lactose around the world. And we cannot go over this here in detail, but you can see up in the top right-hand corner, you can see the companies that I think, are the premier companies in this industry, and that's Arla, Friesland Campina, Fonterra, Lactalis, and Glanbia. Again, significant investments all over the world in the area of whey and lactose. You can see also I included here South America, companies that have invested in additional capacity or in whey processing. And these are, again, big numbers. Now we don't have time for going into the details, but some of you that are speed reading, you can perhaps see that demin whey pops up very often in Europe. The last 2 years has seen a lot of investment in demin whey, and that is one of the reasons right now that I think that we have a surplus capacity of demin whey. And then here again in this area we see quite a number of so-called strategic alliances around the globe. One of these are the one that you know very well here from Argentina, the alliance between Arla and Sancor, but we see that with other companies around the world. What is significant the last few years, that is Fonterra, they have moved very strongly into Europe in this area, given the fact that they have a small cheese production in New Zealand, and therefore they don't have enough whey. So here I'm saying, short term, we may have a surplus of various products like lactose and demin whey, but long term here, I'm sure this will continue to be a growing industry. Muchas gracias for listening to me, and if you have further interest, these are two of the latest so-called multi-client reports that we have produced in our company. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Fuerte el aplauso. Más fuerte.